The Doom of the Haunted Opera by John Bellairs and Brad Strickland. Chapter 5. All the rest of that week, Lewis had similar horrifying dreams. Rosarita had a few herself, but she blamed Lewis for them. "If you wouldn't go on and on about all this creepy stuff, I wouldn't think about it all the time," she complained. That made Lewis angry, and the two didn't speak to each other much after school on Friday. That was when Miss White planned to play a few selections from the opera score for 5 or 6 specially invited guests, as well as for the two friends. When school ended, Lewis hung around, miserable, drained, and tired from the nightmares that kept him awake at night. Jonathan had called again on Thursday afternoon to say that he and Mrs. Zimmerman would need about 10 more days to catalog everything and arrange to have it shipped to New Zebedee. Again, Lewis kept himself from mentioning his fears. After all, nothing awful had happened, except for his bad dreams, and Rosarita's. She looked as exhausted as Lewis felt. "Have another one?" he asked cautiously. They liked each other too much to keep the silent treatment up for very long. She sighed. The two of them were sitting at the back of the music room, a light and airy place with rows of chairs instead of desks. Music stands stood here and there, and a permanent border around the top of the blackboard showed the music staves and the various markings that went on them. The bass and treble clefs were drawn in yellow and white chalk, along with the musical notations from a full note to an eighth. An upright piano sat in front of the blackboard. The whole room smelled of chalk dust and disinfectant, Rosarita finally admitted. "I had a bad one last night. I dreamt I was being chased by all these whistling cats that wanted me to teach them the score of the Day of Doom. They chased me right into a long dark tunnel and then somehow sealed off both the exits. Ugh!" Lewis nodded sympathetically. Rosarita was a lot braver than he was, but a few things terrified her. One was any closed-in space. Rosarita couldn't stand being in dark closets or tunnels, and she looked distressed just telling the dream to Lewis. He sighed and said, "Mine wasn't that bad, I guess. I thought I was in the theater again, watching Harry Houdini and Enrico Caruso do magic tricks while they sang 'Take Me Out to the Ball Game.' Then I noticed that everyone around me was a ghost. Mr. Finster, the theater manager, was there, and lots of others too. None of them were looking at the stage. They were all staring at me, and their eyes were round and empty like little orphan Annies in the funny papers. Then they all started to whisper to me." "What were they saying?" asked Rosarita. She had dark circles under her eyes, and she could not keep from yawning. "It was hard to tell at first," said Lewis, "but it kept getting louder until it sounded like the wind on a stormy day. They were all saying, 'Stop the voices, stop the voices,' over and over again. I tried to get up to leave, but I couldn't move. When I looked down at my body, I had turned into a ghost myself, and I was doomed to sit there in the theater forever." They heard voices in the hall, and a moment later Miss White came in with a group of people. Lewis gulped in surprise. He recognized the portly white-haired Mr. Davis, the mayor of New Zebedee, and Mr. and Mrs. Paulson, who published the New Zebedee Chronicle. They were a tubby, middle-aged couple who looked a lot alike, both with graying black hair and double chins. Fussy Principal Potter was talking to them. There were also 2 women and 2 men whom Lewis did not recognize, but Miss White was chatting away to them all. "And," she said as they stood at the front of the room, "here are our heroes, the ones who made this marvelous discovery. Stand up, Rosarita and Lewis." Both of them rose, although Lewis at least felt foolish doing so. The grown-ups smiled and nodded at them and murmured polite greetings. Then Miss White asked everyone to find a seat. Feels like we're in school again, eh, Letty?" Mr. Paulson asked his wife. She sniffed and did not bother to reply. Miss White stood beside the piano. She was tall and thin and wore a tailored gray tweed skirt and a white blouse and a fussy little black bow at the neck. Her hair was a curly reddish brown, and the teardrop-shaped lenses of her eyeglasses made her look like a cat. "I've asked you all here," she said, "to listen to a few selections from this masterpiece. I believe this magnum opus should be given to the world, and after you have heard a bit of it, I feel sure you will agree with me." She sat at the keyboard, bowed her head for a moment, and then looked up. "This is an aria from Act 1 of the Day of Doom," she said. Mr. Paulson sniffed again. Or Mrs. Paulson sniffed again. "Not a very promising title, Ophelia," she observed. "Oh, but it's very symbolic," replied Miss White in an eager voice. "It's all about the passing away of the old times of strife and war and hatred, and the dawning of a new era of peace and cooperation. Well, well, let's hear it, Miss White, said the mayor. I'm a very busy man, you know, and I'm sure everyone else has other things to do, too. This is the aria. It is simply called The Summoning, said Miss White, and she began to play. The music started out very delicately, a plaintive, rather monotonous melody. Louis gave Rosarita a look that said, What's the big deal? Rosarita just shrugged in response, raising her eyebrows to show that she didn't get it either. Gradually, the music became stronger and more insistent. Louis listened to it, but he did not particularly care for it. He was not much of a fan of any kind of music, not even bebop. Occasionally, his uncle would tune their big Atwater Kent radio to musical programs such as the WLS Barn Dance or the Grand Ole Opry, which played country tunes, cowboy music, and square dance melodies. They were nothing like the aria that Miss White now performed. Louis wrinkled up his nose. He was bored and itching to go home. He noticed, though, that the adults appeared to like the music a lot. They nodded and even swayed a little in time to the hypnotic beat, and they leaned forward in their chairs as Miss White brought the tune to a crescendo. When she stopped playing, they all applauded. By golly, Miss White, said Mayor Davis, I'll confess that I didn't half believe when you told us how good this thing was, but you were right. This Emmanuel Vanderhelm must have been a genius. Indeed, said Miss Paulson, beaming, I have seldom heard a more satisfying yet simple composition. It has all the grace and charm of Mozart with the spirit of Vivaldi and the élan of Beethoven. You played good, too, observed her husband. Why, thank you. They all started discussing the best way to make the music public. Mr. Paulson thought that Miss White should just have a recital, but Mr. Davis shook his head at that. This can be big, he said. Really big. We might get people in to hear the thing from OC 5 Hills, Kalamazoo, and Ann Arbor if we play our cards right. Why, we could make New Zebedee a tourist attraction. How? Someone else asked, sounding puzzled. Why, we could put on the show right here in town, said the mayor. The Eleemosynarian Cultural League has a lease on the Opera House. The league stopped meeting years ago, but there must be 3 or 4 of the members still in town. We just get them together, let them vote to reopen the theater, and there you are. It'll take a lot of work to get that place back into operating order, said one of the other men. And where's the money coming from, Hugo? That's what I'd like to know. They all started to wrangle then, and Rosarita tugged Louis's arm. The two of them slipped out of the room. Whew, said Louis. I'll bet they stay there all night arguing about that stupid opera. I don't know, replied Rosarita thoughtfully. The music was kind of pretty. Ugh, said Louis. Deedle, deedle, doopity doo. I'd rather hear Jailbird whistling. They went downstairs and opened the side door. The junior high was a black stone building next to the high school, and this door opened out into a narrow alley. The day was cool, but the weather had moderated a little, and the ice and snow that had accumulated in February and early March were melting. The air smelled sharp and a little muddy, the smell of spring coming. Jonathan always said of it. Louis and Rosarita walked around to the back of the school to get their bikes. Who's that? Rosarita asked as they rode out of the alley. A man in a long black overcoat stood in front of the school. He wore a black Homburg and black leather gloves, and his overcoat had a collar and lapels of some spotted white fur. The man had a neatly trimmed black beard, and he carried a newspaper. Louis did not recognize him, but he thought the man looked foreign. Children, said the stranger as he caught sight of them. His voice was hearty and strong. Maybe you can give me some help. Is this the school where the students found an old opera score last week? Sure is, Rosarita said. In fact, we're the ones who found it. I'm Rosarita Pottinger, and this is Louis Barneveld. Really? The man asked with a delightful smile. How fortunate I met you, then. I understand you were exploring some theater when you made the discovery. That's right, said Rosarita, the New Zebedee Opera House. Only it's been closed for years and years because Harry Houdini came through once and made a daring escape while handcuffed underwater, and then 2 boys from town tried it and drowned. Everyone loved those boys, and the town was so sad they just boarded the old place up. Louis stared at Rosarita in shock. He liked her a lot, but she always preferred stories that were dramatic and interesting, and she didn't mind embroidering them a little to make them sound better. He almost told Rosarita to knock it off, but he was timid in front of the tall-bearded stranger. The man appeared to take Rosarita's story seriously. My, that is dreadful. However, I am very happy that you two bright children discovered that old score. You see, my name is Harry Vanderhelm, and my grandfather wrote the piece. Emmanuel Vanderhelm, Lewis said. That was the name on the cover sheet. Indeed, as you say, Emmanuel Vanderhelm, a multi-talented gentleman of considerable renown, replied the man. He was, as I am, a singer. Alas, I inherited only a fraction of his great abilities, and my success has been moderate. Still, my father told me many stories of my illustrious ancestors' wonderful career, and I would dearly love to hear his work. Well, gee, said Rosarita, you're in luck. Miss White is inside, and she has the whole score on her piano. Ah, perhaps you two would be good enough to take me there? When the two hesitated, Vanderhelm added coaxingly, you see, a gentleman cannot simply strike up a conversation with a lady without the proper introduction. I would be grateful if you would introduce us. Lewis swallowed. For some reason, he did not care for the idea of going back into the school, but he could not put his finger on the problem, and so he just nodded. Splendid, said Vanderhelm. Lead on, and I hope it doesn't call for a bicycle because I left mine at the National House Hotel. He smiled to show he was joking. They went back in the side door and upstairs. As they walked down the hall toward the room, Lewis could hear the adults squabbling. The door was open. Mr. Vanderhelm did not wait for his introduction, but stepped swiftly ahead of Lewis and Rosarita and entered the room. Mr. Paulson was saying, Hang on. It may be a good idea, but where are we supposed to get the talents to perform an opera around here? He broke off and fell silent, for Mr. Vanderhelm came into the room, his overcoat swirling like a cape. Perform the opera? He boomed in his rich voice. You wish to perform my grandfather's opera? Miss White rose from her seat at the piano, pressing her hand against her chest and looking as if she were about to faint. Mr. Davis asked, Your grandfather's opera? You mean your... Vanderhelm bowed with a grand sweep. I am Henry Vanderhelm, baritone, sir, and I have the honor to be the grandson of the world-famous tenor, musician, and composer Emmanuel Vanderhelm. I believe you were discussing my grandfather's work as I came in. Uh-oh, said Mr. Paulson. There goes our bright idea. I suppose you own the rights to the opera now? Vanderhelm waved a black-gloved hand. The world owns the rights to hear it, sir. Oh, please have no worry on my account. Your enthusiasm for my grandfather's work fills me with an indescribable pleasure. You wish to perform the Day of Doom in New Zebedee? Wonderful, in fact. I, if you will have one so humble, I myself am prepared to stage, direct, and appear in the work, all at my own expense. Mr. Paulson immediately began to applaud, and everyone joined in. Even Rosarita clapped. Only Lewis did not join in. He did not clap because something had startled and perplexed him. Lewis was quite sure that Mr. Vanderhelm had been holding a copy of the New Zebedee Chronicle when he and Rosarita first saw the man. The black overcoat had no pockets. Vanderhelm had not tossed the newspaper into the wastebasket or laid it down anywhere in the room, yet both his hands were empty. Where had the paper gone? It had simply vanished. Like a ghost, Lewis thought, and goosebumps rose on his arms. And that's the end of chapter 5.